I'd like to open the February 14th working session of the Election Law Subcommittee on Voter Registration and Impacts of Non-Resident Voting. Representative Newsom, would you lead us in the pledge, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, I'd like to welcome everyone, the vast crowd here, to the Election Law Subcommittee on Voter Registration and Impacts of Non-Resident Voting. We also want to wish everyone a warm and cordial Valentine's Day. I apologize for kind of a long soliloquy at first, but just a few points of background that I'd like to cover before we start to get into the business at hand. So we have a mission statement that's been reviewed by the minority head there, and I'd like to read that. At the direction of the chairman of the Election Law Committee, this bipartisan subcommittee is tasked with evaluating, consolidating, and reconciling various 2025 House bills concerning voter registration and the impacts of non-resident voting. Accordingly, the subcommittee will review the proposed legislation with attention to constitutionality, any necessary alignment with federal election law, and legal precedents. The subcommittee will consider historical context and opportunities to clarify current regulations. The subcommittee will issue a report to summarize its findings, conclusions, and recommendations. So the subcommittee has been currently tasked with the evaluation of 10 House bills. The assigned House bills were listed in the February 12th public notice for the subcommittee work session. For reference, these are in numerical order: House Bill 217, 289, 323, 365, 385, 418, 472, 618, 684, and 686. All 10 of these bills have already had a public hearing within the House Election Law Committee, and additional bills may be assigned to the subcommittee once they have had a public hearing by the Election Law Committee. And if the subcommittee determines that any of the bills under our consideration can be returned to the Election Law Committee, we will promptly do so. With respect to the subcommittee report mentioned in the mission statement, that will be due out of the subcommittee on Friday, March 14th, and that date will likely be the subcommittee's final working session. For scheduling purposes, I'd like to ask each of the subcommittee members to hold open your Fridays from 9:30 to 12:30 for regular working sessions. The subcommittee will not be meeting on Friday, February 28th, which is a school vacation week, but the subcommittee may have additional working sessions in March so that the report can be ready by its due date. All subcommittee members received 2 days ago a 4-page memorandum from Davis Allen, our committee researcher. Thank you very much, sir. He's sitting in the back of the room, on the definitions of domicile and resident relative to voting purposes. So we thank you for that memo. Appreciate that. Good research. No doubt that will come up in our discussions as we go forward, and we'll find a way to post that for the public as well. If there is any member of the public who wishes to speak on this topic, the subcommittee would welcome that testimony. I would note, however, that all the subcommittee members have attended the Election Law Committee public hearings on the 10 bills under review, and therefore the subcommittee does not necessarily need to hear a repeat of any public testimony for specific bills unless there is a specific question that the subcommittee has about that bill, or there's some new insight that someone wishes to offer relative to the subcommittee focus. So we'll just please note that. We've also invited various people to speak to the subcommittee on the topic. The Secretary of State's office has been invited, and they will be speaking at various times, as well as the ACLU. So we appreciate that. And as I just a kind of final note, I'm an engineer by degree, and as I've been thinking about these different bills and considering them from kind of a process engineering perspective, it seems to me that there's a series of verification events that occur in the voting process. For example, let's consider the most common voter, the pre-registered voter who goes to the polls on election day. That voter experiences a couple of verification events in the process. The event or act of registration before the election day addresses the question, is the voter qualified? The event or act of check-in on the election day addresses a couple of questions. Is the voter registered? And if so, is the identity of the registered voter confirmed? Again, I'm using this most common voter example of a pre-registered voter who goes to the polls on election days. That represents a large majority of the voters in New Hampshire. The voter then receives a ballot and votes are counted and tabulated. And the review of the voter list by the supervisors of the checklist addresses a couple of the questions. Is the registered voter still active? And is the registered voter still domiciled in this town or city ward? And those are important questions to answer. Now, those are only a couple of illustrations for discussion purposes, but it's sort of like these verification events that are meant to ensure that New Hampshire elections are safe and secure. And it's important to make certain that voters go through appropriate verification steps to ensure the elections are safe and secure. So that's kind of the foundation that I'd sort of like to lay for this subcommittee. We have a series of bills here, and again, we'll kind of muddle our way through these, but there's a number of bills that are from similar sections or identical sections. So for example, there are 4 bills from RSA 65913. They are 323, which is relative to requiring the presentation of a government-issued photographic means of identification in order to vote. And there is as well 472, requiring voters to prove domicile, which is RSA 659.13.1c, and then 618 and 684 are also from 659.13, and so 618 it enables election officials to verify the single use of an out-of-state driver's license presented when a person votes by using the centralized voter registration database. And then 684 is preventing the use of student identification cards as a means to obtain a ballot. And so I think for the purposes of this committee, I'd like to just start by looking at those 4 bills. They're relatively short in length. But they all pertain to 659.13.
Chairman,
Yes, sir.
if you would, HB also pertains to that, as well as 317, which was not on the list. So.
Thank you, Representative C. If I read the bill correctly, there 385. So it's interesting. They attack. Part of this is our trying to reconcile different parts of the RSA, and 385. That was the one you mentioned, right?
Yeah.
That has. I thought I read it correctly. Maybe I did not. I thought I wrote down it pertains to 654.12, but I may be wrong. No.
I think it's part 2.
Part 2? Oh, maybe it's, yes.
It's on page 9, sorry, number 7.
Oh, I should turn this on.
Oh, okay. So it makes a cross-reference, right?
Part 8.
So, so anything that 1569 last year affected, this bill basically is flipping it and putting it back before 1569. So it affects a lot of sections. I can go through and, since I wrote
Since you wrote it?
well, OLS wrote it.
Since OLS wrote it?
But
Okay.
since I can go through, but it does affect this one, but it affects a lot of others too.
Yes, there are. I was going to say, because that's one of the longer bills. It's 19 pages. I want to kind of review that in a perhaps future session, if that's okay. Just because I think that would give the subcommittee a little bit more time to prepare. I know you're well prepared, no doubt, as one of the authors or sponsors, but I think it would be useful to perhaps tackle that in a specific subcommittee working session.
All right. So, so before that, I'll get a list of all the sections.
Yeah,
too.
that would be awesome.
Okay.
That thank you very much. So I would say if we go with 323. All right, so that bill as proposed eliminates doesn't eliminate, but it rewords some portions of that. And basically so it actually technically moves the section that discusses out-of-state driver's license and non-driver's identification cards from that section, and then kind of summarizes it in down below in section 2A under 1 and 2. So it basically says a driver's license issued by the state of New Hampshire or the federal government, the government issued ID, and then or an identification card provided under the various RSAs listed there, referencing 260. Also, United States Armed Services identification card, passports, and it eliminates other identification cards that are not government issued. And then it makes provisions for if the person has newly moved to the state in a new Section 5 under 659.13 Roman numeral 2, and makes provisions for both out-of-state driver's licenses and non-identification cards, or non-driver identification cards, sorry. And then just reorders that. So basically it requires a government-issued photographic means of identification in order to vote. I think that seems to address the verification of identity adequately for check-in purposes and things like that. And it would address some of the qualifications perhaps as well, but that's a different section that, or so if we're looking at that from different perspectives of equal vote, treating, we're not creating a separate class of citizens because we're requiring all two classes of voters. We're not requiring we're not creating any subclass by requiring all voters to provide government-issued IDs. Where it doesn't appear that we would be, because we're requiring it from all voters. We're making provisions for those who don't have a driver's license or a non-driver, and through the non-driver identification cards. We're making, and then for those who do have driver's licenses, we're addressing that through the aspects of either a New Hampshire one or an out-of-state one is also permitted under certain conditions. So as we look to this particular one, is there anything that we do we feel that this would adversely impact voter registration, or that it would somehow inhibit non-resident voting at this point?
Yes.
Yes.
Representative Lane, what?
The simple answer is yes. It does impact it tremendously. And it's clearly targeted, I think, at students. And there was no offer of any proof of any fraud or anything by any students in when it was presented. And and I guess one of the questions I had was, my understanding, at least from some of the testimony, was that the UNH card may well be a government issued ID. And I guess that was one question I had, because during the testimony, I think it got raised. I can't remember who raised it, but it may well be a government issued ID because the UNH is part of the state government. And I thought we should maybe clarify that.
Okay.
I'd like to
Yes.
respond to that.
Representative
I believe the question on the student ID was that they did not have an address of their physical domicile, of their location where they live. I think it was just like a generic UNH address. I think that's what was brought up. So it's not really telling on the ID as to their exact living location.
So it doesn't identify the domicile.
It has just like a UNH, and I think they may have even said possibly a PO box. So I recall that.
I think what I'm sorry, do we want to just converse, or do you have to recognize us?
I don't, why don't we converse for the moment? If I am
fails miserably.
I do have a gavel here, and I will enforce it if necessary. I think it's good to have the discussion. So let's
yeah,
do
and
that
just so you know,
reasonably.
that's what we did last year when we did the campaign finance one. And I don't think Jim Qualey ever had to gavel anybody. So hopefully we'll
find out.
Yes, you're right on the PO boxes, but my recollection was that was for the people who were living on campus, and that they came to a PO box. If you lived on campus, they all got assigned a PO box. And that's so if you have a PO box on it, you live on campus. And if you don't, then it's not going to, I don't think it has an address, but this is just for identity purposes, not for domicile purposes. So as long as it has the picture and the name, isn't this just for identity?
So if a person is pre-registered where the residency or domicile has been already identified, that would be valid. Same day registration, I think that creates tremendous problems because you don't really have, unless they're providing other evidence of their domicile address, that can be substantiated. And I do think the PO box as an address under any circumstances has some issues, again, just relating to how can you check and verify that this is a legitimate residence or domicile. So the chair would like to recognize one of our members, and forgive me, I don't have your name memorized, but please introduce yourself, and thank you for coming up and speaking.
Yes, thank you very much. My name is Michael O'Brien. I am a lobbyist at Party Strategies and represent America Votes. Just wanted to sort of echo Representative Lane's point here. So IDs are used to prove identity. So, for instance, a passport, which is a government ID, I could bring to the polls to prove who I am, but it will not have my address on it, right? But that does not stop me from producing a passport and you saying, yep, this is who he is. It has his picture. It has his name. It is an official ID and therefore proves identity. I would then have to produce something else beyond my passport. So I just want to make sure we're not sort of convoluting the purpose. A New Hampshire license could prove both, right? It could prove both your identity and your domicile if your address is correct on your license. We heard testimony just this past week. When you go to the New Hampshire DMV and you go to update your address, what they say to you is, you can spend $50 if you want right now, or you don't have to, and you can just keep your license as is. And so lots of folks have a license that is not with their current address, but they are up to, like, they are completely within the law. They have done what they are supposed to do. And so when we're talking about ID, I just want to make sure that we're clear that that is to prove identity. It can be used to prove domicile, but it does not have to be used to prove it. And in many cases, like I said, with a passport or something else, it might not. And that's okay. I think as long as, again, there is a secondary document that must now be shown to prove it. And I just want to be clear about that for this committee, that we're dealing with two very separate things that these IDs prove.
Thank you very much, Mr. O'Brien. Are you willing to take some questions?
Sure, of course.
So to your point, though, is if there's a registration process during which different qualifications must be addressed, and then there's the identity process for checking in and receiving a ballot, and I agree that a government issued ID that, like a passport, that does verify your identity would be suitable for a pre-registered voter, and they would not have to. And would you agree that in those circumstances they would not have to produce anything to prove their domicility unless it had changed recently?
So if I'm a registered voter and I show up to the polls to go vote, and I'm already registered, right? So I show up, what the law dictates right now is that you prove identity. They certainly do read your address to you, right? You go to the checklist. I say 3 Rockwood Terrace. I don't know if I should say that out loud, but anyway, and then I get my ballot, but there is no, as discussed in a previous bill, right? So you're there to prove identity, and so the ID works for that purpose, which is the purpose of what the law reflects right now.
And then for those people who are registering same-day voting,
sure,
they're going to at least require something to prove their identity.
Yep.
And then if they don't have an address on that identification, they need something to prove their domicile.
Correct. Yep.
And then if there are any other qualifications pertaining to the right to vote, then
Sure,
those
yeah, they
also
would need
have
to
to be-
prove citizenship. They would
Age, right.
all those things would have to be proved somehow. But again, an ID can prove multiple of those things, right? As a New Hampshire license can prove your age, it can prove your domicile, and it can prove your identity. It cannot prove your citizenship, as we've talked about, right? And real IDs do not prove citizenship. But it could prove 3 of the 4, and then you have to produce the last document. They can, but not always, right? And this goes
Right.
back to that. It's not always going to do that. So it is now incumbent upon the voter to make sure that they have all of those documents ready to produce for the supervisor checklist, so that they can be registered. And that's, again, an ID, a college ID would prove one thing. And we know that colleges work to help make sure students have all the appropriate information, but their ID would just prove who they are. And that's the end of it. And they have to produce the rest of these in order to qualify to vote.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Does the subcommittee have any other questions for Mr. O'Brien at this time?
Maybe later.
Yep. Sure. Yeah, of course.
And I know this might sound silly, but so when students provide their ID, are they showing a different, another form of their domicile?
Yeah, I believe they have to. They would 100%. UNH, I believe, has a list of like where the kids live, so that they can cross-check to make sure that they're in the right spot. Oftentimes, they have a letter, right, with like, this is your dorm, this is the address of your dorm. I believe they have to produce that in order to prove that they live on campus. Or, as Representative Lane said, if they live off campus, right, then they would have to either have a license with that on it, or produce a lease or something to prove that they are domiciled in New Hampshire. They cannot just produce their UNH ID. It would not be enough to verify domicile for students.
And is this the same for freshmen that are just moving to New Hampshire and, within the couple months they can vote based off of that information?
Yep. So they'd have to produce, again, their student ID would prove who they are, and then they would need to produce something that proves that they live, in whatever dorm we live in, or again, whatever apartment they're renting, whatever the case may be for that particular student.
Okay, thank you.
And I want to stress too, it's not just students that we're talking about here, right? So, let's say you work for BIE and you have a badge, and, maybe you forget your license at home, but you have your work badge because you're going to work right after, right? Like, we trust BIE, I think, as a pretty large employer in the state to produce a badge that is, and that's ultimately the way the law is written right now under 1569. And certainly the Deputy Secretary can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's up to the discretion of the moderator, right, to say, yes, this is good enough, or no, it's not good enough. And we've sort of said, like, we left it open a little bit more under 1569 than we had under previous legislation, I believe. So.
And when you're talking about the proving residence, domicile, all that stuff,
Sure.
that occurs to check qualification at registration.
Correct.
As opposed to under 659.13, obtaining a ballot.
Correct.
Which is what I thought we were talking about with RSA 323, is when going at the polls to get the ballot. Correct.
Correct. So right.
So there's no currently there's no reason to prove domicile residency to obtain the ballot. Correct.
Correct. That's exactly right.
Thank you.
And so this is right about during the registration process is what we're talking
So
about.
all that stuff's already happened when you registered.
Correct.
And even same day registrants go to a different line
Correct.
to make sure all that flies before getting the obtaining a ballot is a separate time and what needs to be proven.
Hopefully not too much time, but unfortunately
Right.
this year we did see some pretty long lines. So, but yes, you have to register first, and then obviously you get your ballot once the registration is complete.
I would just, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
Representative
I
Lane.
just want to remind everybody that we have a letter from both the clerk and the moderator from Hanover that's really extensive, that was presented as testimony, that talks about what they accept in Hanover. And she mentioned several different, like, really large employers that have different, they take that ID, and these are for people just for the ID, to show that who they are. And so I think, I can't remember the names of the companies, but they're pretty big employers. And I think they take like Dartmouth Hospital, they take those as IDs. And, yeah, Hypertherm. That was the one I couldn't remember. And so I just want to remind everybody that that's in there about what that moderator does and what that clerk does and what they've worked out with the Dartmouth students as well. And they do have lists of who lives where on campus, and they provide that. And the clerk, I think the clerk's office has that list when they're there, so they are aware from a domicile standpoint if they ever want to ask. But and they've come up, and I think the folks in Durham do the same thing, not so much maybe with employers, but I know for the students they do, because I used to have to observe over in Durham and watched what they did. So, but yeah.
Subcommittee have any other questions at this point? All right, thank you, Mr.
Thank
O'Brien.
you.
All right, so we've sort of looked at that, and we've looked at 323. And I'd like to also look at one of the other bills that is applicable to 65913. Again, recognizing that, yes, all of these intersect at some point or another. But so the next one on my list is 472. All right, this is again another short bill. It repeals 659.13.1 Roman numeral 1C and provides that if the voter does not have proof of residency or domicile, and then lists utility bill, lease, deed, similar documentation of the voter's domicile address, the ballot clerk shall direct the voter to see the supervisor of the checklist. And then they review the voter's qualifications and determine if the proof of residency or domicile is valid. And if they are established, the voter is allowed to vote. If the supervisor of the checklist determines that they have not been established, they shall not be allowed to vote. And it says a voter not allowed to vote as a result of the determination of the supervisor of the checklist may take an immediate appeal to the Superior Court as provided in RSA 654.12 Roman numeral 5. All right, so again, I believe, just double check that, I believe this would be, we're checking in, but we probably have a circumstance where,
The one that's effective is not in the purple book.
right,
It became effective on November 11th.
right. So, yes. I have to bear with me for a moment while I look that up online, I guess. But Okay. Yeah, so this is the hours of polling section, and then the 659.13. And then the new paragraph for C1 starts out just for, so everyone knows, if the voter does not have a valid photo identification, the clerk shall direct the voter to see the supervisor of the checklist. Let me see, make sure I have the right one. Yep.
Yeah, so it seems that this bill is trying to remove what happens if they don't have a valid photo ID and insert if they don't have a valid domicile proof, which isn't required in any way, shape, or form at this time at obtaining a ballot, which seems rather odd to me.
Right.
And just not a bill that's sort of, it's changing something that in the wrong place, if anything, to me. I just don't understand where they're coming from.
Right.
And unfortunately, I think this was the one the sponsor was not available to answer any questions on.
Right.
I think you're right. I recall that. Thank you, Representative Newsom. I do believe that is correct. I think that is a problem. This may be one that we end up returning to the Election Law Committee early for addressing
ITL?
that. Well,
I think it's the word you're looking for.
Yes. I'm trying to give some deference to the sponsors and so on, but so
I think that this is my notes indicate that Secretary Scanlon said that there was no requirement to show domicile when checking in, and that this was a conflation of two processes. Is that process?
Yep, processes. Yeah. So,
It makes, and he also suggested it would make check-in chaotic and a disaster. I think those were his exact words.
Right. So I think we're in agreement that, as I think I said in my sort of drawn out opening remarks, that there is a registration process and a check-in process, and if the two are being conflated, then that is not something we necessarily want to do. It's if I give the sponsor the benefit of the doubt, I'm assuming that perhaps the thought process was a same-day registration, and they were trying to address that aspect, but this is the incorrect place to do that.
And I just want to, I think I may have misspoken when I said the sponsor was not there. I'm not 100% sure on that. I may have been looking at my notes on a different bill, so I want to remove my comment about that.
Oh,
I'm not sure.
No, but she introduced the bill very quickly and then left because she had to be in another committee, and she did not take any questions. So she was here briefly, but then left and didn't
I just
take
wanted,
questions.
I was looking at my notes on a different bill, so thanks for clarifying that, Representative Lang.
I look at this and I think it applies to all the bills that we deal with, is we need to be very careful about distinguishing registering to vote versus voting. And the registering to vote, there's an in-person process, there's a by-mail process, and same-day process. So the same-day process is probably very similar to the in-person process. And then the other is obtaining a ballot and voting, which would be in-person and absentee. So we need to keep the registering and voting separate.
Yes, and thank you, Representative C. I think that's absolutely right. I think we want to keep those two processes separate, but we also want to make them a level playing field for all voters. So, but that level playing field must meet a minimum threshold of authenticity so that we can ensure the public that our elections are safe and secure. So at this point, I would, I'm not sure if this is, if we can make an official motion, but I think this might be one that we could return to the, I'm not sure if this is an action that a subcommittee could take, but I think this is one that we could possibly return to the election law committee for further action. Does,
I would agree. I just don't know what the process, I don't know what the, do we have to make a
Process is-
formal vote, or do we just recommend it back? Go ahead and recommend it back, and I mean, we have some time to do it, so I mean,
Yeah.
we could check in with,
well,
we could do that
we'll
and then check in with
let's check
Ross.
in. So we know the intent for what we
Yeah.
want to do with this particular bill for that reason. So I think let's check in with the powers that be. Do you happen to know, Mr. Allen? If the subcommittee is going to refer a bill back to the main committee, is there a defined process for that? Thank you. All right, so I think we have an action that we can take with this, and then, I would note just on behalf of the prime sponsor and the other sponsors listed there that if there are some good elements that belong in another process, we should consider those. But so before we dispose of this, I encourage the subcommittee to review this to see if there are pertinent elements that we would want to use in another bill, perhaps for processing purposes, in terms of, if proof of domicile is appropriate under registration, and there's elements here that are not already addressed in the RSA, then that might be something worth considering. It's a homework assignment for myself to go back and double check that to see if there's any elements there that would be an improvement to the current process, currently defined process, and if there are, then that would be also one of our recommendations out of at least the majority report, and we would, but we would still get this bill back to election law so that we can process these more effectively for the House sessions as well. All right.
If I may,
Yes,
This-
Representative C.
this bill sort of shows what happens when you conflate different processes into this. If this bill had had Part 1 be dealing with registration and Part 2 dealing with voting, then we could have more easily considered it.
Yes, thank you, Representative C. I think that's important. It's as the Secretary of State noted in his testimony, there was a conflation of processes, and I think that we do see that as I'm sure many other committees see that. We often see that in election law where people are conflating different processes, and so again, just we need to think about registration and then check-in to obtain the ballot. And then we, as Representative C outlined, we need to also think about some subcategories that occasionally occur during those processes. So we have same day, we have pre-registered, same day registered, absentee ballot aspects in cases where they may not have been a pre-registered voter as well. So, all right. So let us now move on to, we've addressed two of the bills under 659.13. The next one is 618. Representative C, that is your bill. Would you like to make any specific comments with respect to that bill? I'll give you the floor for the moment to, if there's anything you wish to say about that.
Okay, this one was dealing with using an out-of-state driver's license or ID for to go vote. And the idea here was that we're supposed to get, if we move to New Hampshire, we should get within 60 days a New Hampshire driver's license and do any other things that are incumbent upon someone changing their domicile. And what this does is just allow a one-time exception to use an out-of-state driver's license, assuming that the person just moved to the state and had not yet had a chance to go to the DMV. So it was basically to give people who just moved in the state that opportunity to vote without being harassed too much. But the idea was that the supervisor checklist, and I believe it was in there on on page 1, line 19 and 20, it says the ballot clerk shall also advise the voter that this out-of-state license or ID may not be used for voting purposes again. So if somebody is moving to New Hampshire, they need to do all those steps that are incumbent upon changing your domicile.
Right, and this is. Thank you, Representative C. And just for context, I'll refer people to Mr. Allen's memo that talks about. Let me see if I have that handy here, but. That talks specifically about the definitions of domicile and residence, and that one aspect of this, and I'm just taking this from the statute rather than an inhabitant's domicile for voting purposes is that one place where a person more than any other place has established a physical presence and manifests an intent to maintain a single continuous presence for domestic, civil, and civil purposes relevant to participating in democratic self-government. They have the right to change domicile, but an intent to change it in the future doesn't necessarily apply in those circumstances. So I think we also heard testimony that once you vote, you're now sort of making that declaration of an intent to establish, and then the requirements for motor vehicle registration kick in at that point, or for driver's license, excuse me. So that might be something that the Secretary of State's office could comment on if that's possible, is with respect to a driver's license, whether when a person votes for the first time using an out-of-state driver's license, what aspects kick in at that point. Would you be able to accommodate us here, Deputy Secretary? I welcome Deputy Secretary Hennessy to the subcommittee. Thank you for offering testimony here today. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Happy Friday, everyone. Erin Hennessy, Deputy Secretary of State. I was just trying to look up. I know there is I'll go through another bill that is in front of a different committee. I believe you may have just voted on it in the House yesterday. There is a bill that went through House Transportation that requires the Department of Motor Vehicles to use the information that we collect in our statewide voter registration system that identifies voters who have used an out-of-state driver's license. I don't know the exact wording that transportation decided on, but it would require the DMV to then contact those voters to say, "Hey, reminder, this is state law. You've used this driver's license. You are required, if you are driving here in New Hampshire, to get a New Hampshire driver's license." But currently, what our office does, there is a different law, and I apologize, I don't have it in front of me, that requires us to send letters to people who used an out-of-state driver's license to check in to inform them of the law that but there's no, would say there's no ramifications otherwise. It's just informing them that you checked in with an out-of-state driver's license. But there's no, they don't need to follow up to get one because of that letter.
All right. Thank you. I think it was House Bill 133 that from the transportation that if memory serves me correctly. So that and so that would require the DMV to, I believe, contact these persons who voted with an out-of-state driver's license that now that through the act of voting, they've declared their intent to maintain that presence, then they have to comply with the other legal requirements that New Hampshire has established for those who move to New Hampshire.
Yes, I believe that's
I have not worded
Yeah.
it as graciously. No doubt I have not worded it as graciously as the bill has, but that's the essence of
yeah.
it.
And I would just say that the DMV, I believe, would not contact somebody if when they were provided the information from our department, that their database now shows that that person does now have a driver's license. So the two database information would be bumped up against each other.
Yes, thank you. As I just to remind everyone, the testimony during that House Bill 133 determined that I think the year was 2016, and there may be updated information, but that the compliance rate was something like less than 20% of those who actually did transfer their driver's license over to New Hampshire. It was, I believe, 80. I think the actual number that was used in testimony was 86% failed to comply with the request. And so I think this is certainly something that we want to make sure we address, because that level of compliance is really unacceptable. So hopefully House Bill 133 has done that. I know this is kind of preliminary question, but would the Secretary of State's office anticipate more coordination with the DMV for the purposes of this, or I mean, you already sent to them a list, right?
We actually we would be sending the list to them now. We already have the information. We already do some letters through our office. Some of the letters we won't need to do anymore because they were affidavit related, but this would require us, we already do have some shared information with that department because of HAVA law requirements, but this would be an easy database share, information share, if you can imagine a report. But that's related to HB 133.
Right.
For this one, the concern that I have is that ballot clerks do not, under law, have access to the statewide voter registration system. So if somebody did check in with an out-of-state driver's license or attempted to, then they would have to, we would either need to change our reporting on our checklist to identify that that person had previously checked in with an out-of-state driver's license, which would be system changes and possibly a longer checklist, or we would then have to send that person to the supervisors of the checklist. So similar to the bill that you were just talking about, there would create longer lines and a little bit more chaos at check-in, because if somebody has to go to supervisors who do have access, supervisors would have to look up to see if they used one previously in the state SVRS system. However, not every supervisor has access on election day to the registration system, just because of different constraints in our polling locations, including Wi-Fi and system access. So,
Is there so currently those that currently the Secretary of State's office has that list of voters who voted using out-of-state licenses. That's correct, right?
yes, so when on election day, if a voter checks in using an out-of-state driver's license, they are the ballot clerk, either on the paper checklist or through the poll pad check-in process, and then ultimately through the paper checklist, must put the two letter initials of the state that somebody checked in. So if I am just moved here from Massachusetts, I haven't gotten my New Hampshire driver's license yet, I use it to check in to prove my identity and to receive my ballot. They will put MA on the checklist, and that would be then uploaded into the statewide voter registration system.
Would the statewide voter registration system have the capability to identify on a town or city ward level out-of-state voters who voted there previously?
So thanks for the question. That's what I would have to say, is that we would need to change the report that we do for a checklist on election day, and then, which would be a system change with a cost related. And then the more information that we put on the checklist, the longer the checklist gets. So we were just looking at a bill that's coming up this week that you're going to hear that requires more information dealing in that same section on the checklist. And our take is that if we put more information right in that spot, we would have to add another line for each voter, which if you have a 1,500 page checklist, now you have a 3,000 page checklist. So yes, we can do it. There's just some things to consider if we were to do that.
The do you know, would the Secretary of State's office be able to supply this subcommittee some metrics around this? For example, could you tell us the number of out-of-state voters at any given ward, and what are the top?
I'm sorry, the term out-of-state voters there.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you.
I appreciate your clarification there, Representative Newsom. Perhaps a Freudian slip. I don't know. Is it possible to determine those who have voted in New Hampshire using an out-of-state driver's license, and to tell us some metrics, to provide some metrics around this? Did I'll pick on Hudson. Did Hudson have 10, since I'm from Hudson, did Hudson have 10 voters who are claiming domicile in Hudson who otherwise fulfilled all the criteria but used a out-of-state driver's license for that purpose in the last election?
I believe we would be able to give you that. I'd have to check. Sometimes we're constrained on what information we can and cannot give, and I don't know all the details behind that, but I will get back to you on that and let you know.
Would you like an email from me as a formal request, or?
Sure.
I'll try and word it nicely so that that can be done. All right, great. Does the subcommittee? I see.
Would that information about out-of-state driver's license usage be able to encompass the exceptions to requiring somebody to get a new driver's license. For example, if you come to New Hampshire and don't own a car, I believe there's an exception to having to get a new driver's license. Would that information encompass that, where somebody wouldn't be required to get a new ID that way?
So our database does not have DMV information on that, or car registries. So no, it will just give you information about who used an out of state identification to check in to obtain their ballot.
Thank you for taking my question. I was just wondering, does each town clerk get a list of people who used a out-of-state driver's license or ID? You said it indicated the initials for the state, like MA or VT or something like that. Or the supervisor checklist, do they have that information for each voter at the time of the election?
Thank you for the question. So after an election, the clerk will have the paper checklist, and it will be on the paper checklist. So they do have that information. It's just not summarized for them. So you would have to flip through each of the pages to see who voted, who checked in to vote using an out-of-state ID.
Okay. As a follow-up, for the next election, will the supervisor checklist know who used an out-of-state ID for the last election?
There is no law requiring the supervisors to look to see how a voter previously checked in to vote, or what. There's no look back requirement like this legislation proposes.
So the supervisor checklist do not have the information, or they're just not looking for it?
I will say that they are not required to look for it. And if they were to look for it, there's nothing in law that allows them to do anything with that information. Does that make sense? Like they're not a law enforcement. The DMV would be the only. Well, I can't say. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not law, so I can't say what the DMV or the Department of Safety does if somebody has an out-of-state driver's license beyond I think it's 60 days that they're allowed to.
Okay. And for this particular bill, then, is there no way that that this could be implemented based on what you have now?
I will say that I think HB, if HB 133 is correct, I think that would be the better way to go to require somebody to get a New Hampshire driver's license when they meet the criteria of having to get a New Hampshire driver's license when they move to New Hampshire, only because that would put it in the Department of Safety's wheelhouse, when the law enforcement side of New Hampshire, rather than in an election officials arena where they are not a somebody who has the, let's say, capacity on election day, but also under law is not required to enforce a Department of Safety law.
All right. Well, then there's another bill that just requires a total ban on the use of an out-of-state ID, so that would work to accomplish this.
If that is your intent, yes.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. So it does say that the ballot clerk needs to change change the address in red. That when they're checking in with an out of state, they're making a notation that it's an out of state on that checklist. So is it the supervisor of the checklist responsibility to have that on the next checklist? Or is this that doesn't go anywhere? I guess I'm a little confused. Thank you.
The checklist for an election that's printed out shows the registered voter's name, and it shows their address, which they've proven to get onto the checklist. Under current law, it would be a physical piece of paper or a New Hampshire driver's license. Under previous law, they could have used an affidavit to attest to that domicile. So it'll show the domicile of where they live, but it will not show how many times they used an out-of-state driver's license to prove identity or which state they used. It shows their voter qualifications.
Thank you. If I may ask another further question, is it possible, or would you foresee any problems if the Secretary of State's office provided to the supervisors of the checklist kind of a separate form that would be able to capture out-of-state driver's licenses for easier check-in process during the registration on voter day, and then per the proposed bill, a look-back process as well?
Thank you for the question. I think adding another piece of paper or another separate checklist that maybe have to be used in the same day would be more complicated. So if you're going to require additional information on the checklist, I would just say keep it to one checklist. Keep it to one database that's printed out, or one poll pad check-in, because if there's multiple things that somebody has to look at or fill out at the same time, humans are involved, and you may have errors in making sure that they agree with each other.
If I may just...
Maybe I didn't understand your question.
No. I think it's good. I think your answer was fine. It is a busy time during election day, and when you are doing same day registration and you have multiple pieces of paper with which you must process a large number of voters, you certainly want to minimize the challenges and difficulties that supervisor of the checklist or moderators or other election officials have to deal with, without a doubt. It would seem to me that if a person is presented, if an election official is presented with a list of voters who used I want to say this correctly, voters who used an out-of-state driver's license in a previous election, and that was limited to that particular town or city ward or town ward or what have you, and there was some basic information about which state it came from and the identification of the person and those aspects, then that shouldn't be too onerous a task. Again, I'm assuming that there's not a large number of these type of people, but again, if we need the metrics on that. So my question was, I don't think it sounds like it's too onerous a process.
Well, I guess I would just have to ask, the supervisors are not the ones that check people in to vote, so they would, if we gave them a list, that's the ballot clerks are the ones that check people in to vote, and they look for identity. The concern I have about excluding out-of-state driver's license from checking in again, if somebody's not required to get one, for example, if my father, who's over 65 years old, lives in Florida, comes to live with me permanently, please don't, if you're listening. If he comes to live with me permanently, he's not required to get a New Hampshire driver's license. He can, if he's not driving, he can use his expired Florida state driver's license to prove his identity to go get a ballot, as long as he's met his other qualifications to prove domicile, his age, and his citizenship. So we could definitely add an extra space on the checklist. The checklist may get a little longer, notifying a ballot clerk that they've previously used an out-of-state driver's license to check in, if that's what you're looking for.
So I could see in those circumstances. So, thank you for that response. That is an important aspect that we need to make sure we address in this process. Would a person meeting the criteria that you described, maybe not directly related to you, be able, for your sake, be able to obtain a non-driver identification from New Hampshire?
Yes.
Is that process extraordinarily difficult, or?
I don't believe it's difficult. I think it's going to the DMV to get that ID, but it is a process. Yep.
Representative Burnham.
Thank you. Do we know how many out-of-state licenses are used each election? Do we have an idea?
I think that's the report that the chairman wanted me to get, and okay. I will see if I can get that. I don't think there's restrictions around that type of reporting since it's public checklist information. So, but I will see if I can get that for you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. And then just another one question here. So depending on the frequency of how many out-of-state licenses are used for identification, do you think it would really double the checklist, or maybe just a page or so?
I would have to wait to give you that information, and also figure out what the programming is, because if it's a line, if it's a field where it's either filled or not filled for every voter, then it would be a field for every voter, which would add space to the checklist. But again, I can't tell you that for sure unless we've programmed it to figure out exactly what you're looking for and how much space that would take up.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Having done some programming myself, being an engineer, I understand that if those were not in the initial requirements, a new space is sometimes interesting challenge for databases and things like that. So if when you're registering in-state, when you're registering voters who already have a New Hampshire identification, a driver's license, when they're capturing the state at that point, or is it just assumed to be New Hampshire?
So I think we're conflating two different things: registration and voter check-in. And this bill is obtaining a ballot, so that's voter check-in versus registration. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
And the questions just keep on coming. So, Representative Newsom.
Thank you. Is it fair to summarize this as saying that this bill would create for a violation of DMV regs, the penalty for that would be a loss of constitutional right to vote?
I don't think I can answer that question because I'm not a lawyer.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
I wanted to go back to your comment. Oh, okay. wanted to go back to your comment about the out-of-state driver's license for those who don't drive here. And I think we heard testimony, I think it was from Olivia Zink from Open Democracy on a personal level about taking somebody who was 92 years old, lived in a wheelchair, lived in a, if I'm not mistaken, some kind of nursing home or a care facility. And so she would not be able to use that driver's, she's from Maine, she had a expired Maine, she would not be able to use that more than once, even though, I mean, and maybe not for us, going to DMV is hard, but there's a lot of people, going to DMV is hard. If you don't have a car, you're not driving, so you don't have a car to get there. And then and the other thing is, it's not just, there's a large population that going through and getting there and maybe have to take a day off from work to do it. It just doesn't seem right. And I guess it's not, I guess my question to you is, and what other, give me a minute. We also heard about UCAVA voter, not UCAVA, but military don't need to have an in-state license. How do you handle that with your reports? If they're a military person and they come in with, do they get marked down as using an out-of-state license?
That's a good question. I don't know what they would present as for identity. They may be presenting a military ID. And again, this is not ID to show domicile. It's ID to show identity. So they could be showing a government issued military ID with their picture on it. Hypotheticals I'm not very good with because I come up with lots of different options for you.
I get it. I was wondering under this bill, and that's not really for you to answer, but it's a good point. It is just for ID. So thanks.
Representative C.
Yes, just to follow up on all this. If somebody registers same-day voting, they are then still registered for the next elections?
Yes.
Okay. So if this bill were changed to limit the out-of-state driver's license to same-day registration, and that the normal registration in advance of an election would require an in-state driver's license except for seniors, would that work?
I would say, again, you have to look at DMV law, which I'm not a lawyer, nor do I work for the Department of Safety. But if I had just moved to New Hampshire and established my domicile a week before the election and did not get to the DMV yet to get a New Hampshire ID, it is difficult sometimes to get a DMV appointment within a week. I think you'd be not allowing somebody to vote even though they would be qualified.
Well, as I was trying to present it, maybe I didn't word it very well. Allowing same-day registrants to use an out-of-state license.
Okay.
Or an in-state if they have already taken care of it. But for the normal registration period before the election, they would need to have the proper in-state ID except for seniors.
I have to take this one back to my team on that.
Would that not be creating two different classes between seniors and non-seniors with what would be acceptable?
We always have at least two classes of voters. We got absentee voters and in-person voters. We've got old voters. We got young voters. Any two combinations of words, you can come up with a list.
I think if we can borrow from the American Disabilities Act, we're trying to do reasonable accommodations for different scenarios. And so for those who are no longer driving, certainly if someone was still driving, they would be required to get a new license, wouldn't they?
With some exceptions out there. For example, if they don't have a car in the state, they don't need to get one. So if they're a student coming in from somewhere else and they don't have a car, they don't bring a car with them, which I'd be willing to bet most, certainly freshmen especially, will not have cars, if not most students generally. Or the car may still be registered to their parents. They would not be required to get a new driver's license here, is my understanding.
We will probably have to take that up with someone on the legal side, because if they've, as we've heard, if they voted, they've now declared their intent to be in New Hampshire, and therefore they have to comply with the other applicable laws. But
which, as they're currently written, very well may not require that license. So the solution may be over on the other side rather than here. But I agree that I think delving deeper into that aspect may be required.
And I also think that if the ultimate goal is to deny them the ability to vote, that's a severe penalty for just not getting a driver's license. And I'm not sure it's proportionate to the crime.
all right, well, there's obviously a few things to consider here for this particular bill. And we need to make certain that the appropriate exceptions are accounted for. And you're right, there may be some other solutions that reside more in the DMV side of things than, such as HB 133 tried to address. Are there any further questions on this particular bill? Let's give you a little break here, perhaps. Are there any other questions at this point on 618 for Deputy Secretary Hennessy?
No, I don't have a question for her right now, but I
Okay.
have something that's just come to mind.
Okay.
So I have a mother who's recently had to move in with me that I have to care for, and she requires care when I'm not home either. It's just challenging. So, and she's a voter. Her mind is all there, but her body is failing in movement. So it was very challenging to get her to her city hall to get an absentee ballot physically. For me, it's a lot of work. So looking forward, I'm and now that she's possibly going to be living with me permanently, I think about how is she going to vote, because she wants to vote. She'll be moving into my town, so that she'd have to change. Part of me wonders, is there something we can do with, and this is just a thought, but can we do something that is, she probably won't be able to physically go to vote any longer. so she'll probably do an absentee ballot. But for those people who do want to go and have the proper assistance to do that, can we have some kind of identification, like at the town and city level, where they can retrieve that to make that process? Just a thought I'm throwing out there versus DMV versus showing that they're living in a particular place with a.
Or at, say, a college or school level as well?
That it's all the same. Yeah. I mean, but it would be through the town or city that they reside in, not through a school, but through the town and city where they're voting in. I'm just throwing a thought. I'm just trying to see where this information could be captured and processed without going through DMV and licensing, but driver's license. It's obviously, like, my mother isn't driving and her license will expire, and I'm not going to probably take her to DMV because it does take almost a month to even get an appointment. So just kind of throwing that out there, something to think about. But anyway, thank you.
Something like a voter ID card. I've seen that in other states. I don't know that I've seen it in New Hampshire.
It could certainly be used for voter, but it's also just an ID in general. Like, this is the town that we reside in, and here's my photo with all that information captured in one. And it could be definitely used for voter from that, because you're voting in your town and city. So why not have that common thread of identification?
Mr. O'Brien, we welcome you again to the subcommittee for testimony.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, my name is Michael O'Brien with Party Strategies on behalf of my client, America Votes. And just for you all, I know I'm around here a bit, but this is my 12th year sitting around the Election Law Committee in various hats, and so I've been immersed in this for a long time. Just quick on the 60-day piece. The first time I interacted with this was when I had moved. I lived in New Hampshire in an apartment. We just bought our house. My wife was the theater director at Winniscom High School, and I was driving home on a snowy night and thought that the breakdown lane was a right-hand lane, and so took a right in the breakdown lane, and some lights flashed behind me, and the police officer pulled me over and said, "Did you know?" And I said, "Oh, I'm really sorry. I mean, I legitimately thought it was a right-hand lane, and that's what it was there for." And he said, "You were from around here?" And I said, "No, I live," well, I've already given my address, so whatever. "I live in Auburn." And he said, "Oh, your license is Manchester." And I said, "Yes, I haven't updated it yet." And he said, "You know, you have 60 days to do that." So first, I just want to be clear that it's not just out of state, right? If you move within state, you have 60 days. The penalty for that for me, though he was nice to me and took mercy, would have been a ticket, right? I would have gotten a fine from the state for not following up with motor vehicle law. To emphasize the point, going from a fine to not being able to vote is a pretty big jump. The second thing I want to just reemphasize from what I said earlier, if I show up with an out-of-state license because I just moved to New Hampshire, it does not prove I live here, right? I need something else. So I think we're once again conflating two things here that are very different. One is proving who I am, right? I'm from Rhode Island originally. I try to hide the accent as best I can. Every once in a while it slips out. If I show up with a Rhode Island license, it still proves who I am. At the end of the day, it proves who I am. I need something else if I have that Rhode Island license to prove where I live and that it is in the state of New Hampshire. And so I just don't want us to, it feels like we're crossing this line again where we're saying we need to do an in-state license because it's going to prove where I live, except again, I will have to prove something else while I register in order to do that. So, and the last thing I just want to, in addition to some of the things we've talked about, before we had to start scheduling our presidential primary earlier, sometimes the presidential primary falls within 60 days of the next election, which will be, for most residents of New Hampshire, the March town meeting. And so it is possible that I could vote in 2 elections in this state well within the 60 days and not have yet violated motor vehicle law at all. And so when we put this sort of one election restriction, there could be someone who was well within their rights to not have changed their ID yet, but is now hung up in this restriction. So I just want to be clear about all those things, and especially again, identity is proved by a license. It can prove domicile, but it does not have to. And if it does not, you must produce something else. And so that's really all I have.
Right. So again, I think the lesson for today is, there is registration and there is check-in, and at least the requirements to demonstrate either should not be conflated. They are sometimes jumbled up for same-day registration and other aspects like that, but we need to, as a subcommittee, make sure that we continue to keep them separate. And I think a statewide we need to make sure that we account for these election circumstances. I'm not sure I remember hearing that during the public testimony. Perhaps it was, but we need to make sure that if there's a local election and then a primary sometime in the within that period, that people are still enabled to vote. I know, So you had further comment, please.
I was going to say, and goodness knows we have enough special elections in the state that oftentimes they could fall within each two. So there are just lots of ways of which this could run afoul without someone running afoul of the 60-day notification of the DMV.
All right, thank you. Do any Mr. Representative Seat?
I just wanted to point out that, and it was pointed out in testimony on one of the bills we heard, I think last week, or this week, that if you move within New Hampshire and notify the DMV, you do not get a new replacement card. So it has your old address on it until it's time to renew your license. If the state police radio in to the DMV, and they can find out your current address and know that it's been updated, but other than that, it's not on the card.
Yeah, that's correct. He asked me and I answered honestly, which was, I guess, my my mistake. But again, luckily he let me upload, so I appreciated that.
I remember doing that, and the back then, this was a while ago, the DMV just gave me a sticky thing with my new address to put on the back, and that was supposed to last for a couple years. Fortunately, I didn't get pulled over.
I didn't even get the sticky. They just told me to use a Sharpie on the back. Yeah.
Obviously, a prudent cost savings measure by New Hampshire. So we commend the Department of Motor Vehicles for being prudent with the taxpayers' dollars and doing that and saving the cost of stickies on the back of driver's license. So any other questions for Mr. O'Brien? Thank you so much. Appreciate that. All right. So I think we've looked and examined through 618 fairly thoroughly here this morning.
I think so.
The prime sponsor acknowledges that. So if I could, I'd like to move to then the next one that we have, which I think is unfortunately. Oh, yes, Mr. Allen. Yes. Would you mind just coming up to the microphone and responding to that? So, and do introduce yourself and your position, and if you can, restate the question that I asked.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, I am Davis Allen. I am the committee researcher for both the Election Law Committee and for this subcommittee of election law. So the question you and the subcommittee had asked earlier was the procedural questions regarding how to report back to the main committee on your determinations on the bills that have been referred to this subcommittee. My colleagues have provided answers that we would be having a subcommittee vote relative to any recommendations that would come out of the subcommittee. It does not have to be a roll call. It is up to the subcommittee to determine how they will go about it. Examples came from subcommittees for commerce, in which they just do raising their hands to get the count. There should be a work session sheet or work form that the subcommittee would have, and that would be utilized for that. And then the subcommittee chair will usually be the one to communicate the subcommittee's recommendation to the full committee, either during a full committee work session or the relevant executive session.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. And we would also make the standard motions, as it were, for each bill. Is that correct? I do have work session forms in front of me, and it appears that they have the normal motions: ought to pass, amended, ITL, retained, and so on. So those would be those are the motions that the subcommittee would make on a given bill. Is that the implication there?
That is my understanding. It was not explicitly stated, but I would gather from the information provided that is correct.
Right. Just as a follow-up, could you ask if there are any other options that we have? I think for this particular bill, I think we know what we probably want to do, but if there's any other options that are available to the subcommittee, I'd be curious to know what they would be. So if you could look into that, that would be much appreciated.
Yes, sir.
All right. Thank you so much.
Of course.
All right. So, so the last one, so 684 is the other bill that I want to look at least for right now. This is another bill that is specifically addressing the 659.13 subsection. And so I wanted, again, my kind of goal here for at least the first part of this meeting, or second part after the soliloquy, was to try to address some of these bills, short bills that have a common RSA section in them, so that we could, we're sort of looking at the same subject at the same time. So again, let me just briefly review this House Bill 684. It's an act that, as written by OLS, states preventing the use of student identification cards as a means to obtain a ballot. It does not, oddly enough, the bill itself does not prohibit the use of student ID cards, but instead requires driver's license issued by state or federal government, identification cards under 260.21 and various subsections there, or a non-driver's identification card issued by the Motor Vehicle Division, department, agency, or other office of any other state. And then more armed services identification cards, or United States passport or pass card. So those are the types of identification that would be taken, and just the main body of the bill. I kind of laid down the examples first here, but the main body of the bill says a valid photo identification shall show the name of the individual to whom the identification was issued. The name shall substantially conform to the name on the individual's voter registration record, show a photograph of the individual to whom the identification was issued. So, so far so good. And then, so name, photograph for identification purposes, expiration date that has not been exceeded by a period of more than 60 days. Here it carefully notes that except that a voter 75 years of age or older may use an otherwise qualified form of identification that has an expiration date that has not been exceeded by a period of more than 1 year. So again, the desire to keep a relatively current identification means photographic means, I believe, and then the rest. The bill states the following forms of identification bearing a photograph of the voter shall satisfy the identification requirements, and it's that list I read earlier: driver's license, identification card, armed services identification card, or a passport or pass card from the U.S. So, again, except for the poorly worded title, I don't think it just makes a requirement rather than a prohibition. So I'm not sure why that particular title was used, but
I think perhaps it went to the intent of the bill, because all the student ID things in the existing law are not there. So I agree with you. I don't think it's the best way, but I think that's what they did when they wrote it, is they rewrote it to exclude all the student ID.
I want to check and see if that is 659.13.2a. It does remove some subsections of this of student identification cards, which are not ostensibly, well, remains to be seen perhaps, but are not issued by a federal or state government responsible for those sorts of specific identifications.
Although the section above, the 2A section above the enumerated list, doesn't say government issued, does it? Or am I just missing that?
No, those are captured in the first four.
Right.
So,
those are examples of all examples of government issued, and those shall be accepted. But as you said, that it's not an elimination of other items, that the paragraph above says the requirements are, it shows the name that matches the registration, and it has a photograph, and it's basically not expired. That those are the three requirements of a valid ID to obtain the ballot. And that the enumerated list of 4 just gives examples of things that hit those 3 requirements.
Right.
So it doesn't, yeah, but we saw that the other day with a different bill where the analysis statement was exactly the opposite of what it was trying to do. So,
right. And we recognize that the OLS had an extremely large number of bills to process during that time. And so that we will extend grace to both sponsors, co-sponsors, and the OLS
Exactly.
for potential inconsistencies. So
to me, if you're eliminating 5, I believe was the one in the current law as being eliminated, that you might as well eliminate 1 through 4 because those are clearly going to hit name, photo, not expired, if that's the goal of the legislation here.
Representative Newsom, can you comment on the not, what do you mean when you said not expired?
Well, that's one of the requirements in that paragraph 2A, is that the ID is not, or essentially not expired. I think there is a grace period.
Right, more than 60 days.
Yeah, and yeah,
except for voter
with an exception.
I note that that the sponsor did raise the exception for the voters 65 years of age or older, up to 75. On behalf of those who are in that decade between 65 and 75, I thank the sponsor for that sort of courtesy, as recognizing the youthfulness of people between those parameters. So I do appreciate that. So I think there are, I believe when this came up, or maybe this was on another bill that talked about government issued IDs. I do believe that that kind of language is used elsewhere in the RSAs. I know I have seen that specifically, so I need to do some research on that. I think that's kind of really the hinge. I'm mixing up my words. It's the linchpin or hinge point, and I was commingling those terms. That is important. Deputy Secretary Hennessy, would you be kind enough to entertain a few more questions with regard to identifications, in as much as you can? I apologize. Thank you.
Sure, I will try.
Yeah, we and the subcommittee greatly appreciates it. So just a question generally. On government issued IDs for New Hampshire state or other federal issued IDs, is there a capability for the Secretary of State's office to easily verify the validity of those type of government issued IDs? Is that easily doable, or I'm sort of in circumstances where the Secretaries of State's office might be required to verify identity based on government issued IDs, is it easy enough for the Secretary of State's office to do so?
Thank you for the question. I will say we are not required to validate an ID. The IDs are all shown locally to local election officials, either to a clerk who intakes a voter registration and looks at the identification, a supervisor of checklist who does voter registrations either at a meeting or same-day registration, or a ballot clerk that would look at the identification. But we do not have any means to make sure they're not fraudulent in any way, I guess. Is that what your question is?
Maybe. Well, certainly we want to prevent fraud. So,
Yeah.
So the ability to check that, in certain circumstances certainly would be beneficial, but perhaps that's not the most relevant point. Let me try another. Let me see if I can ask a better question for you. In your election manual procedure, you identify different forms of identification that would be accepted, and currently you just basically follow the statute. Is that correct?
Yeah, we follow this. We do follow the statute. And the statute.
Yay!
we don't get to make stuff up, which is great. Yes, we follow the statute. Yes.
All right. Thank you. If an election, let me ask another question. If an election official were to have a question about a particular form of identification, would they be calling your office to adjudicate that?
Great question. I have received a question one time about a tribal ID, and my response was yes, those are valid IDs that you can accept as proof of identification. So we do get questions on, is this form of ID okay? And we will go to the election procedure manual or to the law, and we basically recite back the law to people who have questions. And I believe probably the AG's office may get additional questions. And then other election officials may bounce questions off other election officials. But we were not the sole source of question answering.
If I may, just a quick follow-up to that. Is there following elections, is there any sort of a debrief between you and the AG's office about these sorts of questions with regard to, hey, did you get any identification questions, and are there opportunities to clarify things in the procedure manual or the like?
Yeah, good question. Our office is in, I'm not going to say constant communication, but very frequent communication with the AG's office, especially around law changes and any information that we distribute to the public. For example, today we issued a press release around HB 1569 reminding voters, if you haven't registered, this is what you need to bring to register to vote. And specifically after elections, our office goes, discusses with the AG's office what some of their representatives may have found at polling locations when they do the AG's checklist, which is a checklist of all the requirements that each polling location is supposed to have. If there are frequent questions that come up, our offices will discuss them together, but I can't say that what type of ID is a frequent question that we get.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very helpful. All right. Any other questions? Oh, Representative Lane.
Thank you. And thanks for being here. It's very helpful. How many instances of ID fraud are you aware of, say, in the past 10 years?
That would be a question for the AG's office.
Okay.
Yep.
Is anybody coming from the AG's office?
Not today. We can certainly.
No, I mean later.
We can invite them, yes.
Yeah. Because I just want to make sure we're solving a problem that's really out there. That was my question for both. When I was fumbling before on the other bill, that was the same question.
Okay.
So I'll ask the AG. So thank you.
Not seeing any further questions. I want to thank you again for providing that testimony. I would suggest if we could take maybe a quick 15-minute break and that would allow Representative Lane and I to have a brief discussion and then maybe a separate caucus and then reconvene in approximately 15 minutes. Would that be okay? All right, so we will recess or break for 15 minutes and resume at approximately 20 of 12.
Mr. Chairman, before we do that, did Mr. Allen, I think, looked like he was approaching the mic. I don't know if he had an answer for us.
Oh, yes. Did you have a further answer for us?
Thank you.
Please, yeah, then we will postpone the break for this important update of information from Mr. Allen. Thank you, Mr. Allen, for again providing answers to our subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy to be here. Happy to support the subcommittee and the greater committee. So relative to the question of what motions and options are available to the subcommittee, it is only the standard motions that are allowed to be made. If the subcommittee cannot reach a majority recommendation, that is also acceptable, and the subcommittee chair would then report, the differing opinions of the subcommittee. Outside of making any motions, the subcommittee chair can also, in those executive sessions or work sessions of the greater committee, can relay any information that is pertinent to the recommendations and decisions made by the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Allen. That was very helpful. Again,
Very welcome.
Appreciate it. All right. We will now break, and we will still reconvene at approximately 20 of 12. See you then. All right, so we'll reconvene the subcommittee work session here. And let's see, at this point, we're going to take a look at taking action on one bill. Representative Lane, do you have a motion you would like to make?
Sure. I would like to move that we recommend or that we ITL HB 472.
Representative Lane makes a motion that we ITL HB 472 requiring voters to prove domicile. Is there a second?
I'll make a second.
Thank you. Representative C makes a second here. So just one moment while I capture this. I'm my own clerk here. February 5. Okay. All right. So the motion is ITL. It's been moved and seconded. Let's have a discussion on this. Is there any discussion? Representative Lane.
Sure. I'll just speak to the motion. During testimony, we heard that this bill conflated domicile and identification, and that we really felt that given that we needed to distinguish it between registration and voting, and for that reason, we felt the bill as written was confusing, and we would just prefer to ITL it, and we'll move on to some of the other bills that we have before us. I don't know if that's enough, but
Any further comments from the subcommittee?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I just I believe that although it's a good bill, it's just in the wrong location pertaining to the RSA that's addressed in the bill. So for that reason, it does have a conflict. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Representative Burnham. Again, I would also echo what has already been said by both Representatives Lane and Burnham, is that it really is a conflation of these two processes, the registration versus check-in. And while you do have to provide proof of domicile when registering, you should not have to prove that at check-in. And so we need to make sure that we keep the swim lanes clear and that those two processes are not conflated in any way. And for that reason, that seems to be an appropriate analysis of the situation. So at this point, we're allowed, I believe, as Mr. Allen explained, we're allowed to take simply a vote, a simple vote. We don't have to do a roll call. And so we'll just take all those in favor of moving House Bill 472 as ITL to send back to the Election Law Committee for further processing. Raise your hands. All right, 5-0. So, okay, so at this point, the committee has, I'm not sure of the exact right wording, but we'll say has moved this bill back to the Election Law Committee on the basis that while it has merits, it does conflate the registration and check-in process, and then therefore is inappropriate at this time for further consideration. All right, so thank you for that. Congratulations, subcommittee. We've accomplished at least one thing today. Yeah, we made our load lighter, and that's always a good thing. So let me just look at. We have approximately another 45 minutes, and I'm wondering if we can tackle a few others.
were there other categories like what you did here that refer to one or?
Yeah, I'm thinking that it might be possible to no, I misread it. No. I don't. So at this point, so my dilemma is that we start to get into the longer bills if we try to combine those that intersect similar RSAs. And again, I'm going to reserve 385 since that is 19 pages. I'll reserve a full session for that at some other time.
365, is that's the one about proving citizenship?
385 maybe.
Yes. 385 is
the really long
the 19 pager. I'm not going to do that today. I think let's just bear with me for just a second here. We could do let me just see if there's any other. Why don't we look at least discuss for House Bill 686. It is 3 pages. It's requiring a voter to provide identification when requesting an absentee ballot. Why don't we take that as our next task for today? We will basically try to discuss this and see what sort of information we can do on this. So let me just kind of review this very quickly. The analysis states that it requires anyone who requests an absentee ballot to provide a copy of a government-issued photo identification along with their absentee ballot application. It requires that the application be notarized, and it requires a person to cure any errors in the application in person and to prove their domicile to a city or town clerk. And then just summarizing, section 1 is a long form encompassing approximately 2 pages, where it goes through a list of different qualifications that would make the person eligible for an absentee ballot. It includes absence due to residence outside the United States, religious observance, and disability. And so I'll just, there's quite a list here. So just for the purposes of the public being aware of this, they can look it up online themselves. But just to remind us as a subcommittee, it's someone who is duly qualified. They're absent and will be absent until after the next election, or they're unable to register in person due to a disability, so they're requesting the appropriate forms. They'll be absent on the day of election. They're confined to a penal institution for misdemeanor or awaiting trial. They're requesting a ballot for a primary election. They cannot appear in public on election day because of a religious commitment observance. They're unable to vote in person due to a disability. They cannot appear at any time during polling hours because of an employment obligation. And for the purposes of this application, this takes care of it includes the care of children and infirm adults with or without compensation. And then it also has a winter storm warning proviso where on the Monday prior to an election, they can use this if a storm warning, blizzard warning, or ice storm is predicted for the next day. Then on the next page, it's if you're elderly or infirm or have a physical disability, or if you anticipate school or childcare or adult care will be canceled, and you then need to care for children or infirm adults who could not be taken care of by these services during that day due to the closure of those services. And then it says anyone who, it gives a warning that anyone who is using the absentee ballot for inappropriate purposes are subject to being guilty of a misdemeanor. And then it asks for specific things, presidential primary, state primary, general election, declaring party for primary election purposes, and then takes down the information from the applicant. So the name, the voting domicile or home address, and then identifies a different address if other than the home address, if you're away for that extended period, phone number, email address, signature, and so forth and so on. And then someone who's assisting, someone who has a disability who cannot sign directly, allows that person to sign as completing that form on behalf of that person who has the disability. And then page 3 then gets into really the notary aspects of this process. So, and this is the additional aspects that are being provided here. Most of what I read before is not new; it is current. But what is new is the applicant must sign and notarize this form to receive a absentee ballot. And the person who witnesses and signs, assists a voter with a disability executing the form, shall sign and notarize. The moderator will compare the voter's signature application with the notarized signature on the notarized statement. And if the applicant does not have the form notarized, the bill proposes that the applicant's ballot application will be rejected, subject to curing the defective application under 657(6)(6). And there's also a requirement to provide a color copy of a valid government-issued photo identification to receive an absentee ballot. I believe that the sponsor explained that this is less easy to forge, and states that if a color copy of the photo identification is not provided, then it will be rejected, other than the ability to cure the defective application under 657(6). And then finally, it goes on under 657(6). It adds a new section. Any applicant whose application form does not comport with the requirements above under 657(4) may appear before the city or town clerk, subject to their ability to verify their domicile with the clerk and amend their application form to cure any and all defects. So again, just requiring that if they're going to cure it, they do so with the clerk, city or town clerk, so that it is really seen by someone who serves as an election official, and it's being appropriately remedied under those circumstances. So that is the bill before us. And really I think the key perhaps the key part is the notarization, if I can sum it up. All right, having kind of covered that bill, are there any comments from the subcommittee? Representative C.
Yes, this ends up being a situation where if other legislation passes, they could be required to get two notaries, one on the application and one for the absentee ballot. The form on the outer or the inner envelope. And just under that, I would think that on this, I would be more interested in having the notarization on the inner envelope of the ballot itself as being the person who filled out the ballot rather than the application. But I don't think the notary needs to be done twice. And also, I just noted on page 3, line 5, where it says applicant must sign and notarize. I think that would properly be need to say and have notarized, because presumably the applicant is not a notary, and I would also guess that a notary would not be able to notarize their own documents.
Could you point that out where that is again?
Page 3, line 5. And it just says the applicant must sign and notarize, but the applicant doesn't notarize it. He has it notarized by somebody else. And also, if the applicant goes into the town clerk should be able to issue that. And we had a bill that would allow the town clerk and deputy clerk to be able to essentially notarize a document even if they are not an actual notary public. So my concern is that this is asking for we could end up asking for an absentee voter to have to pay for two notaries, and I think that's a little excessive.
All right, thank you. Representative Lane.
I would agree. Well, I think asking the notary on either place is inappropriate, and I guess not inappropriate, but unnecessary. But focusing on this bill, not everybody had, I don't have a color copier. I just don't understand why it needs to be a color copy, and I don't understand why it needs to be a copy. We've lived without it all this time, and the Clerks Association was against this too. So I guess I'm just not quite sure about, one, a color copier, but you're also going to be requiring people who want to vote absentee to either have a copier or get to a place with a copier, and particularly if they're infirm or, not able to get out of the house, they're not going to be able to get to a copier. I just don't understand the requirement. I think it disenfranchises a lot of folks.
Your point is noted. I think, again, we want to have everyone on an equal playing field, and I don't know that we want to have for absentee ballots, the act of registration and check-in, the two processes that we've been talking about, are distinct and should be distinct and different, but not so different as, but not. I'm sorry. Want to make sure I say these words correctly. Is there should also be for absentee ballots a registration and a check-in process. It by nature has to be different because of the nature of absentee ballots, but the same questions that are answered for the pre-registered election day voter that I discussed earlier still need to be answered for those applying for an absentee ballot. And so I think we should look at this and determine, is it answering those fundamental questions, again, in order to ensure the safety and security of our elections, but also to make accommodations for the person requesting the absentee ballot, but also still have a level playing field for all voters having to go through the same sort of verification steps in the voting process. So it does seem as if this notarization is an extra step that is being required, and so it has some issues with it. In lieu of I guess my initial thoughts are, if some election official or town or city ward official is not able to complete those processes, then a notarization might be an acceptable alternative. They're not a election official, but they have sufficient qualifications to authenticate the identity of the voter and some of these other qualification aspects that we might need in that sort of circumstance. So I need to think through this a little bit more, but I think I just want to give the subcommittee an idea of where I'm thinking about this, or how I'm thinking about this. I want to make sure we answer the same questions for all voters in terms of verification, but I also want to make sure, and I want to make sure that if the normal processes, if these can be done by election officials, then we shouldn't need a notary. But in the absence of election officials or appropriate local government officials or Secretary of State office officials asking those same sorts of verification questions, then it might be good to have the notary as an alternative to these other things if the other things cannot be obtained in those processes. If that made any sense. I see you look at me quizzically.
Yeah.
So.
No, it made sense. I guess part of the problem of getting the color copy, or going out to get a copy at Staples or wherever you might go to get one, is you're still going to have to go out, find a notary. You're going to have to find somebody who come to your house. You're going to have to be able to afford to pay them. And I think somebody mentioned that might be a poll tax, but I don't know. I'm not saying that, but it just seems like there are barriers being placed that we don't have now. Excuse me, that we don't have now, but yet no one has given us any evidence that this is really a problem. So again, I come back to, are we really solving a problem here, or are we just theorizing?
Thank you, Representative Lane. I think my response to that is I think we're trying to achieve a level of consistency of verification, and we're again, if the earlier remedies of town officials, local government or state government, Secretary of State's office, for example, cannot answer those verification questions, who is going to do that? Perhaps, and I'm not saying that this is the solution, but perhaps a notary public who can attest to the validity of the documents presented to that notary republic without color copies or what have you, but they can attest to the authenticity of those documents and confirm that these things have been appropriately presented, and then authenticate that through a notary. I've only had something notarized very infrequently, so I'm going by memory, which is over 10 years old at this point. And so, in that case, it might be, it is something worth considering that could be an option. The only other option would be, we would have to, we would have to look at, how can we then confirm these, qualifications if they're registering, or identity if they're voting, or checking in ostensibly to obtain the ballot if they've already pre-registered. How can we confirm those in a manner that provides the same level of verification that the pre-registered election day voter goes through? So I think, again, that is just sort of my forgive me, simplistic way of looking at this, but I think if we can endeavor to kind of make sure we have that level playing field, and then for those who have unusual circumstances, if accommodations need to be made, make accommodations, but then also make sure that those accommodations are sufficient to fulfill the verification requirements. So I'm still processing this, need to think about this, but I think that's, I'm not saying that, I don't believe that notarization should be required for every absentee ballot. I think that's very clear, but I think it could be an option, again, when these other verification components are not being fulfilled through election officials or state officials. How do I know that my vote is not disenfranchised by an absentee ballot that hasn't been properly verified or identified? And so it's the risk is, do I know whether or not it's authentic? And so those are my thoughts on the matter. I see my colleagues to the right who I've been speaking to the left side of the room here, or my left side of. You asked the question, so I apologize, but he was first. All right. So Representative C, what wisdom can you impart to this subcommittee?
Okay, you touched on part of this was on the color copies and stuff like that. If you're having somebody notarize it, if they can see your driver's license or whatever ID you're using, it doesn't have to have a copy. The concern I have is this application, I believe, is for somebody who is already registered to vote. So at that point, we're only trying to identify that it's the correct person who's requesting the absentee ballot. And
not part of this, but when they send the ballot back, we need to make sure that the ballot came from that same person. So the other part was the distinction of if they apply in person at town hall, the town clerk should be able to take care of all that, and it should not necessarily be notarized. It's only if they're mailing in the application from wherever they might be to get a ballot sent to them that the question comes up of the identity of the person mailing it in. But I think the biggest concern for absentee voting is making sure that the ballot itself is from the correct person. I'm not as worried about who's applying for it.
All right, thank you, Representative C. Appreciate those comments. Representative Burnham.
Thank you. And I might be opening a can of worms here, but today we have technology, we have phone devices where we could take a picture of a person, we could take a picture of an ID. It's colorful, it's beautiful. How is it possible that it could be submitted, and is that legal?
That is a good question. We should certainly the banking industry and the finance industries have extensive means of identity verification that are in use today and provide ostensibly very secure confirmation and verification, authentication of identities. So, perhaps that is something for future consideration. And I'm guessing that would probably have to be done at the state level, and so Deputy Secretary Hennessy, I'm not sure we need you to answer any questions, but we're in our discussions, if I may summarize for you, we are discussing the fact that the banking industry, the finance industries have a lot of remote identity authentication technology in use today. Every people can do remote banking, and people can do remote other things with financial people. And therefore that is, certainly a technology option that we could consider. It is not something that I would ever want to consider at a local level because of the cost and mandating it to the local towns and city wards. And also, they certainly don't have the, if you will, the cybersecurity vigilance. They don't necessarily, I don't want to diss any of our local IT folks, but they don't necessarily have the full cybersecurity capabilities that, say, the state of New Hampshire might have. And so it would seem that one possible alternative to this identification for the purposes of submitting an absentee ballot could be technology that would come through the Secretary of State's office. Of course, this would require a finance commitment and other provisions, no doubt. We would have to think more thoroughly about what that would entail. I'm not sure it's something that we could do in this term because of the finance bills having to be in already. But that's something for future consideration, and I think that's that's good. But we're sort of checking down our list of alternatives, directly with the local state, or directly with the local town officials or election officials, perhaps with the Secretary of State's office. Maybe in absence of those two things, then a notarization. Although, to Representative C's point, if we're asking really for an identification associated with the ballot at this point, is that the right mechanism? And then we got into the discussion about banking and finance technology that could authenticate identities as well. So there's a lot of different points discussed. I don't think we'll come to any conclusions, but we will come to the end of the meeting shortly. So, I'm not sure we're going to resolve anything here. I think the points about the wording for notarized is inappropriate. It would have to be have notarized and that sort of thing. And so I think we'll need to go back and look at this a little further and see what can best be done with this particular bill. But I think this was a good discussion. A lot of different points were raised.
Representative Weary?
Yes.
I just want to follow up on Representative Burnham's suggestion, because you could take a picture and then send it via email as part to the clerk. So, I mean, again, that would require a computer and some technological expertise, which not everybody has, but I think if you're thinking about alternatives, Dan Healy, was speaking for the Clerks Association, he says most of his requests come in via email rather than letters. So if you're emailing the request, you could perhaps attach, but it's an image. Really, it's not technically a copy, I guess, but maybe we have to look at that. I'm still not sold on that we need to do this, but if we're going to do it, that's another way to offer another alternative. And I guess I will just stop there.
Well, I guess I won't stop there. I would say that I think the goal is to have basically how to obtain an absentee ballot match how to obtain a ballot in person is the goal here. And I would say that since we have no evidence of fraud happening at the absentee ballot level without IDs, to then, instead of strengthening that or making it harder or however to define that, is to then make the in-person match what we currently have, which is an affidavit, which is what we had several years ago. And that way, if you don't have that ID in person, you're back to the affidavit, and the two different methods of voting and getting that, not voting, of obtaining the ballot, whether it's in person or absentee, those two methods would match up at that point, which would easily and cheapestly solve that issue.
Thank you, Representative Newsom. I think that's an interesting point. I think if we were still doing the traditional legal definitions of affidavit, I would certainly agree that would be good. As we heard from, I think, Mr. Richard in the Election Law Committee testimonies a couple of sessions ago, he pointed out that currently what we're calling an affidavit is more of a self-verification. And so I think I want to avoid turning the check-in process into a Cole Porter musical, anything goes. So I think we have to be a little careful of sliding backwards on the in-person check-in versus tightening up the absentee ballot. Of course, this is the direction I sort of lean toward, and you're certainly right to want to lean in other directions from me. So, all right. Are there any further comments from the subcommittee at this point? In that case, would I hear a motion to adjourn for the day, and we will resume next week?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All right. All in favor? All right. So thank you all for a productive first work session here of the subcommittee on voter registration and impacts of non-resident voting. There will be a public announcement for the next series or next session coming out next week, and it will have one less bill on it, or at least, maybe one more. You never know. So stay tuned. And again, I want to thank the subcommittee members and Deputy Secretary Hennessy for coming today. I know everyone is very busy, and this, for some of us, has been our third day up here. So for all of us, it's been our third day up here. So, and some of us more than that. So appreciate your diligence and your efforts to help improve election law. So everyone have a wonderful, happy, and lovely Valentine's Day.